Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Well, welcome back to the Rural Scoop. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf, and I'm excited that you're joining us today because there are some seasons in policy that feel theoretical, but this one has not been. This one's been all about mechanics, whether it's new laws or new timelines or real dollars moving in ways that are really hitting our classrooms fast. So today I'm sitting down with Margaret Buckton. She is a trusted guide at the intersection of school finance and legislation in Iowa, supporting districts through the Urban Education Network of Iowa and the Rural Schools Advocates of Iowa. And she advises leaders on how to implement what's passing without losing the thread of teaching and learning. Margaret has spent years translating statutes into workable steps for superintendents and boards, and helping folks really separate rumor from requirement and build budgets, schedules, and partnerships that actually fit local reality. So in this conversation, we're going to start with where leaders are feeling it most, whether it's implementing new policies with clarity or what the latest ESA or voucher shift means for stability over the next few years, and how to protect the depth of programming that we have in our rural communities like CTE or dual credit on thin budgets. We'll dig into talent pipelines when the bench is shallow, student wellness, all of those things that really have made a difference to some of our schools and how policy can impact that. So let's get to it. Margaret, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Melissa. And with that agenda, I wish we had about 5 hours and a cup of coffee and then lunch delivered.
Right?
We have a lot to talk about, right?
It is. Well, we'll take small bites of the elephant. How about that?
Perfect.
Well, I'd like to start really with your through line. What is it that ties your path from board service, where you started, to IASB policy work, to the partnerships that you're doing right now with ISFIS, and I hope that you explain what those things are to our listeners, and now with the advocacy work that you're doing. What is that one through line, that one mission for all of the work that you've done?
You bet. This has a little bit of a historical perspective. I worked in the private sector manufacturing and nonprofit and public sector work. But there was a moment when my husband and I found out we were going to have twins 37 years ago. And we lived in Illinois, and we wanted to go back to Iowa where public education was guaranteed opportunity for those kids. And I wasn't in the education field before that, but I got to go to college on a debate scholarship because we had a great public school debate program when I was in high school. And I've traveled the national circuit. Everybody thought it had to be an all-girl private school. And I said, no, it wasn't. This is public school that has a commitment to supporting students' passions. And so when we came back to Iowa and I got involved in my own kids' education, I was working for the legislature as appropriations staff. I was really excited about one opportunity to look at all of the programs, birth to age 5, across all the spectrums that fund them, and try to make sense out of them. And that opened up the opportunity for me to then go to the School Board Association when I left that legislative stash. And I've been a strong supporter of those public school volunteers that help oversee and set the passion and direction for our public schools. And it's so important that we have champions that are doing that work, and then people in communities that are saying, here's all the good things that are happening in our public school.
Yeah. If you had to give a new superintendent a sentence for working with a board in a productive, positive way, what would that be?
Dear superintendent, as you're working with your new board, understand they're your champions and your loving critics. Give them the information they need to help you in both of those directions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. One of the things that I'm sure that you participated in was board training. And As a former superintendent, I participated in those with my board as well, whether it was around onboarding and orientating new members, or it was making sure that we had some kind of plan in place for our strategic planning objectives. But what was a moment for you that really coalesced around, this is what makes a really, really impactful team effort to leading a district?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's such a good question. And I've been on the board training both sides of the table, both as a recipient of it and as a deliverer of it. When I was at the School Board Association, I got to be part, and it really was a privilege, of the Lighthouse study that went into both high achieving and low achieving districts and did a really deep dive on how do boards behave and those board superintendent teams when schools are doing extraordinary things with similarly situated populations of students.
Yeah.
So they're both low poverty, but one is really delivering results. And there was a kind of the synopsis of those 8 characteristics of highly effective board superintendent teams. And going back and seeing that later in my life as I became a board member was a really good reminder of how do we support each other? How do we ask those kinds of elevating questions? And how do we set high expectations for everybody across the system? And I think those high expectations, we believe all kids can learn with the right supports. We believe all board members can learn with the right supports. And in my advocacy work, I apply that to all legislators too. So we just have to figure out how do we get in their reflective pool of what's important to them.
Yeah.
What values do we have in common?
Yep. So let's step into that. What is it that you're doing right now with both rural and urban schools?
Sure. So you mentioned ISFIS, ISFIS in the introduction, and that's Iowa School Finance Information Services. And I'm a partner in we are a for-profit company, but we have all kinds of services we provide to school districts in Iowa. And there are 325 school districts in Iowa. And I work with about 300 of them in one way or another. So it's just about everybody. Through ISFIS, we have advocacy contracts with both the Urban Education Network and the Rural School Advocates of Iowa. And with both of those, we provide all of the membership support services, develop the website, the communications and policies, and of course, represent them at the Capitol. And I always say that people who don't know about the way democracy works in this country think about lobbyists as somebody with a checkbook, a martini, and a cigar behind a closed door somewhere, right? And that's not exactly how it works. As a lobbyist for public schools, I find myself in the role of being a So my job is, of course, to explain to legislators when I can how something's going to impact the state. But I have to connect those local leaders to their legislators and vice versa, so they know how anything that's proposed is going to play out in the communities they represent.
Right.
I've had all kinds of examples where I have seen legislators who have built a thoughtful relationship with a local leader push the envelope and either make an improvement or actually vote against their caucus on occasion when they understood how that was going to impact students and families and taxpayers in their community.
Right. Margaret, what was the moment that locked in for you that, hey, this is my lane, this is what I need to be doing?
When I was legislative staff, I really loved supporting legislators and how much something was going to cost, which is what appropriations staff do.
Mm-hmm.
But there came a time when that wasn't enough for me. I had to tell them what's the right thing to do. And back in the early 2000s, Iowa was working on a source of revenue for school infrastructure. We have a statewide penny of sales tax on every sale in the county that's in the state that's taxable that goes to school districts. And then they locally get to work out with their taxpayers how that's to be spent. But that was originally a local option tax. And then being able to say, we've got buildings that were built the year before Geronimo surrendered. They're not exactly designed for wireless connectivity. They don't understand now that kids aren't walking to school 2 blocks or a mile or whatever it was, but we have to allow for transportation systems and other things. And technology and safety are so huge. And we were talking about that back in the early 2000s. That was an 8-year initiative, but we got it passed. And it was one of the most invigorating things I've ever worked on. It took coalition building. The Farm Bureau was one of our best partners, and to have them as a partner to have taxes go to schools was really nice.
Wow.
So it was finding out who could care and how do you get them the information they need to feel not just empowered, but almost mandated that they have to say something about it.
Yeah. Well, across your members that you're working with right now, what are they asking for? Where's the confusion or the highest pressure points that you're working on?
Boy, I have never felt more pressure with our public school leaders than I felt in the last 3 years. We now have education savings accounts in Iowa. Some people call them vouchers. They're slightly different from a constitutional perspective, but it is state tax money that is going into an account to support every child in a private school with their tuition and other expenses. And it phased in over 3 years. So initially it was means tested, only for low-income kids. But now there is no means test. And we have 41,000 students going to private schools in Iowa right now that are all getting $7,988 per student. So almost like 380 million at the very time when the 480,000 students in public schools are being funded at a rate far below the national average, like $6,000 per student below the national average.
Wow.
And because of that, that conundrum of a policy-making perspective where state leaders think, well, if your public school isn't good enough, you can just go to private school. And yet we have 90% of our kids going to public school, and that not good enough comes from, I would say, some targeted criticism that's not accurate. And then it also comes from the responsibility of not adequately funding our public schools over the last 10 years.
Yeah. Let's step into that. How really have ESAs shifted district stability? And I'm thinking obviously particularly for rural districts in the past year, 2 years, 3 years. And can you walk us through the budget mechanics that those boards have to understand that go just beyond the headline of an ESA?
Sure. So the first thing, most of our private schools, like in most states, are located in densely populated areas. They're in suburbs and urban areas. There are a few geographic spots in Iowa. Northeast Iowa doesn't have a lot of people. Northwest Iowa has even fewer, but they have strong religious roots. And in those places, there are smaller private schools. And I would say in those places, the private and public schools have been pretty good partners for a long time, but that's harder to partner in this particular environment.
Sure.
So the mechanics, if you understand the school funding formula in Iowa, it's based on enrollment counts. So you count a student in October of 1 year, that becomes a funded student July 1st of the next school year. So we're always a year behind from when you do your enrollment count. If a student goes to a private school starting in September and they're not there to be counted October 1st, then the public school won't get the funding for them the next year.
Wow.
The interesting thing about it, we've seen, people say that the ESAs are about parent choice, and there's some truth to that, but I also think the private school, it's really the private school choice. They only go to the students who the private school accepts to enroll. And sometimes the private school accepts the student and it just doesn't work out. And if they come back to the public school in November, after we did that enrollment count, that student doesn't generate funding for the public school in the next year. It's even the year after that. So you're looking almost 2.5 years down the road before the public school is funded technically for that student.
Right.
If it's one student, no big deal. You can probably fit them in a class. If it's 100 students, it's starting to cause problems. So that's one budget mechanic that in Iowa, school boards are heavily monitoring that. But we've had public open enrollment between public districts since the 80s. So we're used to that migration of students from one place to another. The difference is with the public school open enrollment, the parent has to decide by the March 1st ahead of the budget year. The deadline to enroll for the education savings account is actually June 30th. And when you know the way schools work, they've already got their teaching contracts in place. They're already deciding which sections are going to be taught at a school, right? And you don't find out on the 30th of June when they close the application period what student you don't have. You find that out when school starts. So it's a lack of understanding of the timing of the finances and then the reciprocal staffing and budget expenditures to support us.
Yeah. If I were, and that's such a great point. How do school leaders then make sure that the families have an understanding of that scenario, how it affects staffing or offerings that students either now can't have? How do they do that communication?
You know, it is so tricky because it's hard to say, was it because these private school students are going over here? Or was it because our birth rate is declining and we have fewer kindergartners and first graders? Or is it because some parents have decided to homeschool because there are all kinds of technological supports and curriculum supports didn't exist before the pandemic?
Sure.
I think the pandemic really was a game changer for parents understanding the education their students were receiving. So the communication challenge is huge. And I think we have to approach it not so much with blaming as with opportunity. So in order for us to have middle school sports or arts or extracurricular activities, for example, we need parents to advocate to the legislature that a 1% increase per student is not enough, especially if you are in a district that has fewer students. And we've been having kind of that conversation now for, I'd say, 15 of the last 16 budget years in Iowa. The cost per pupil increase has lagged inflation or the cost of doing the business of school.
Wow.
So it's kind of hard to keep making that case.
Yeah.
And it's especially when, you see the line item in the state budget and you're looking at $3.8 billion and you say, how's that not a lot of money? And that 1% increase is less than 50 cents a day per student. So that's one of the challenges we have. How do we get that down to a level that parents and communities and taxpayers can understand?
Sure. So that's a misconception that you're having to correct. What others do you find yourself having to correct, either with legislators or even maybe with people in the education community or with the families that they're working with?
Well, I'll start with teacher shortage because we have some state level leaders in our state who said they've solved the teacher shortage. And they say it's solved because they only have 1% of vacant positions that started this school year. So it may be that all the positions are filled in a suburban district. It may be that district leaders had to make choices. So we have a lot of flexibility now. We might offer Spanish or German as only an online high school credit because we can't hire a teacher.
Right.
Right. But we've solved the problem because that's not a position that's open anymore because we can't afford to pay it if we even had an applicant.
Right.
So part of it is, do we have somebody in a position that is not yet credentialed? We have a huge issue with that in special ed in particular. So we have a shortage of special ed teachers, and then that impacts the workload of all the other teachers. So even though you have a fourth grade teacher there, they may not have the supports they need for all the students in their classroom.
Right.
How do we communicate this in a way that doesn't drive parents to decide, well, I'm just going to send my kid to the private school then? And so we're walking this communication type, kind of a very narrow line all the time. And how do we say, here's how we know we have everything your student needs, and here's how we know we don't have enough and we need more. And it is one of the toughest challenges in this social media, instantaneous communication world we have.
Yeah, definitely. So
I would say one more thing about that. I encourage advocates that they need two things. They need some data. It's a spreadsheet. It's a chart. It's something that says, this is empirical evidence that we have a problem. And they need a heart story, something about a student, a family, a teacher, something going on in their district that relates to and makes somebody remember that data point, because that heart story is what a legislator or a person from your Chamber of Commerce who's willing to advocate on your behalf is going to remember.
Right. I've said that data by itself is dismissible and stories by themselves are forgettable. But when you pair those things together, that's a pretty powerful way to advocate. So I'm right there with you on that.
Yeah. And then the other thing about the teacher shortage that I think is so hard to get people to understand is how hard our existing staff are working. Mm-hmm. Those teachers are showing up every day, doing their best. It just drives me crazy when somebody believes that we're withholding our competence from the school day for whatever reason, right, because we have highly motivated and trained professionals who are there and they're working hard every day. And we've gotten into a little bit of that culture war debate in Iowa, whether it's saying you can't have references to any sex act in a book in the library, or you must show a particular video when you're talking about human growth and development that humanizes the fetus, diversity, equity, inclusion, you name it. It's a culture where we're having that conversation. Sure. Something's been banned and it's all in the cards, and now people are unsure. And it's so difficult all the time to show up for work feeling like if you misstep, there's not just a consequence on your license, but there might be a civil action or something that is not easy to endure.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
that's a problem. Implementing those new laws or new expectations without chilling instruction is certainly something that we're all hypersensitive to.
Yep. Yeah. And so with training, we have to train our staff, and we have to do it in a loving and respectful way. And we have to, and not just our staff, but I really worry about sometimes our school leaders in our most rural schools, because we've got, in Iowa, we have shared superintendents. A lot of states don't have that, but 2 small districts can share 1 superintendent. They both get a little extra weighting. It's called operational sharing. It's the equivalent of counting 9 more kids. So if you think of 9 students times that $7,988 per kid, it's $82,000 each district gets if they share. And then together that can almost pay for that superintendent. Mm-hmm. But now we've doubled their workload. And they are, not just the superintendent. Sometimes they're the curriculum director. Sometimes they're the transportation director. Sometimes they even drive a bus. And to put them in charge of implementing these policies that keep getting passed at the legislature as quickly as they require them to be implemented, it's really an unfortunate position that anybody should have to be in, to be responsible for administering it.
Yeah.
And they too, just like our staff, are working so hard.
Margaret, where would you say that you're seeing districts in this political environment overcorrect? And what guardrails would you say are keeping compliance tight while still protecting teaching and student voice?
That's 2 really good questions. So the overcorrection might be a little bit about free speech rights for staff. Mm. And when staff say something on Facebook outside of school time, not on the school computer, and then there seems to be a backlash to that. How do we protect staff speech rights, free speech rights, at the same time that we're trying to be faithful to the law? Mm-hmm. And there's this perception that you can't do anything political if you're a school employee. That's not true. You can't do it during classroom time, during instruction.
Right.
And if there's the standard, from the Supreme Court, is there an significant impact on the instructional environment for students? So go back to that standard. Don't overcorrect. And, if somebody says something that is embarrassing to the district, if it hasn't impacted instruction, you can sit down with that teacher and say, you don't want to do that again because of this. Next time it might have that impact. But that doesn't mean you have to fire them.
Right.
So where do you walk that tightrope again of that balance? I think sometimes the other overcorrection is really in the area of school finance, because people are so unsure about the future that sometimes they tighten the budget a little too much. And you build up a lot of what we call in Iowa unspent budget authority. and they have the permission to spend it. But if you accumulate too much, what in essence the philosophy is saying is tomorrow's children are more important than today's children. So how do we invest the resources we have today to make sure that kids are getting everything they need? And that might be one of the things that are impacting parent perception or even teacher perception about feeling supported, whether their individual child or the teacher is supported.
Yeah. What about guardrails?
Gosh, we just went through an overhaul in Iowa of our area education agencies. Those are those regional entities that provide supports to school districts, right? You all have them in they're different kinds of names, but that's what they are. And they were primarily in charge of special education, but then also provided education and media services to schools. So one of the more recent guardrails that was put into place for the overhaul of that instruction was the State Department of Education was given an authoritative role on special ed that they had decades ago, didn't have for a while. Now they have it back. So their job is now to provide a little bit more fiscal monitoring than Iowa schools are used to, but to have those conversations about how do we know kids are actually getting the services in the IEP. And I think those are good conversations to have, but nobody likes it when you turn the heat on the pot up a little bit, especially at a time when you're feeling underfunded in general. So it's challenging to navigate those. But another one I think is a good example. We had, as a lot of states did in the last 2 years, a law on restricting access to electronic devices during instructional time, a cell phone bill. And that one was navigated pretty well with the legislature. The governor's office started the conversation, but I'd say they listened well to school districts on most of it, on letting it be a local policy, on making sure that there were exceptions. So if you have a student with an IEP that needs an electronic device, of course, you've got to have that for them. It's not just cell phones when you say electronic devices. There are all kinds of different things that schools are dependent on to meet the needs of students.
Right.
So my only criticism of that policy at all is, again, the timeline and not understanding the cadence of the instructional planning that goes into anything. So if you pass a bill in May and it becomes effective on enactment, like that one, that might have been but in the spring, it's effective on enactment, and then you've got 2 months for the Department of Public Safety to give you some help on what's going to change in your emergency preparedness plan, and how do you communicate with parents, and how are you going to keep devices safe if kids bring them to school, and is there ever a circumstance that they have access to them? Writing that policy. And if we were going to do that from scratch without that kind of a deadline, schools would have focus groups. They'd talk to parents. They would talk to teachers. They would talk to students. They would figure this out in a way that probably would be more tailored to their individual community needs and expectations, but we get there. So we have to hurry up and implement all the time. And then sometimes the legislature comes back and says, oh, we didn't really mean that. Now you got to fix that. And we go back and fix it again. And there's a lot of, I feel like the hamster on the wheel for those school leaders that are trying to do what the legislature wants them to do.
Yeah.
But that's a good policy. Having kids not tied to their phone all day is a good thing.
Yeah, definitely. Can you talk a little bit about, you've worked with finance and in the state, and it can be very volatile. And which budgeting practices really are best suited for small systems to keep steady when there are like valuation swings or enrollment dips? What do you recommend to those superintendents that are trying to just make sure that things are operating the way that they should within their budgets?
Sure. I think one of the most important things they have to do is they have to work with forecasting models to see if this happens, then what's coming. And they should be looking ahead at least 5 years, and they should look at multiple scenarios. Don't assume that your enrollment you lost is coming back unless you have a reason. It's so often tied to housing that if you don't have vacant housing, it's a good guess you're not going to have families come in with children. So you have to look at that. You have to work with your economic development planners and see what's going on in your region. We've had other swings in policies that impact enrollment, like Iowa, the only reason Iowa's grown in our census count in the last several years is because of an influx of immigrants. And if that wanes in any way, then we'll continue to see enrollment decline. They just got the certified enrollment out for this year. So they counted it October 1st, and it took this long to do all of the credentialing and making sure it's certified. But we're down almost 8,000 public school students.
Wow.
And that isn't because necessarily families are leaving. I think we're having fewer kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Our younger classes are smaller. There's a demographic thing about when children are born and how big those high school classes are. That's one thing, but what are we doing on all these other policies that could impact who wants to be here and do they feel welcome? Mm-hmm. So we got that issue. But I think forecasting, looking ahead, trying to see what happens. Iowa does have a couple of things that I think we get right. I'm not sure it couldn't go further, but one of them is called a budget guarantee. So if your enrollment declines more than your funding per child goes up, the district for 1 year get this budget. I call it a cushion if I was calling it anything. It's not a guarantee, but for 1 year, you can actually increase compared to the prior year by 1%. So you're going to have something that helps with the timing, because we usually find those budgets out at the same time we're doing contract negotiations and publishing our budgets. So all the legislative stuff, that's all March and April. So that gives you a year to adjust. And that's helpful in a declining environment world.
Yeah.
When you have fewer students. The other thing that you have to forecast, and you have to be hypersensitive to your staffing ratios and make sure your staffing is responding to the changes in enrollment. And is there a time when you have to go from a 3-section to a 2-section, even though your community doesn't want it, because you're going to burn through whatever accumulated unspent authorized budget you have? Staffing ratios in Iowa, about 80% of our general fund dollars are spent on staff. That's all salary, benefits, everything, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're out of whack with that compared to other districts that are the same size as you probably have some soul searching to do. And then the other thing to think about is, what flexibilities do you have access to? Who can be good partners? We have a lot of sharing going on in Iowa, whole grade sharing, where you might send the whole middle school to a neighboring district and you negotiate a contract with that. And then they might send the high school to you. Or sometimes it's one-way sharing, sometimes it's two-way. Mm. But it's so much better for board members and school leaders to be in charge of their own destiny, in seeing those trends coming and planning for the future, than it is to overspend your budget, which in Iowa, it's not quite a criminal offense, but it sure feels like it. You go before the school budget review committee, which is an arm of the department that's in charge with making sure the schools are compliant in spending. You have to have a workout plan. You have to make huge budget cuts. You then have to go back to your community and say, the budget police are after us, and this is what we have to do. It's so much better if you can see that coming and help your staff understand and gently work your way toward the right staffing ratios. Mm.
Yeah. When you talk about programming like CTE, dual credit, things like the arts, can you talk a little bit about how you've seen that done well, and perhaps its partnership structures with community colleges or libraries, those kinds of things? But how has that been done well in Iowa?
So we have some regional planning partnerships, and some regions they do better than in others, but kind of convening a conversation about what tracks of career and technical education we want, or why are the arts important in our community. And some of that is conversation with local businesses, because, I just like we have a teacher shortage, we have an everything shortage in Iowa. We don't have enough welders. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough attorneys. Right. No matter what it is, we don't have enough. And so that makes competition for our own staff even more difficult to manage, because, the Amazon warehouse needs somebody who can manage workers there. And it turns out teachers are pretty good at getting to work on time and doing what they're supposed to do. But when you can have those partnerships that help to make learning relevant for students, if they can see that this is something that I'm passionate about, that I want to do, and by the way, I can get employed right when I graduate to do that in my own community, then it's relevant learning. So we have one district up in Northwest Iowa that actually has a production facility where students do career and technical education while they are manufacturing parts for businesses in the community. And they have, it's an apprenticeship program. They have all of the competencies that they have to understand. When they make the rest of the learning relevant, when you can learn physics through the application of creating something, I think kids really get the learning. And so having it kind of be connected with some of the things that they have to learn in order to get the right, check the right boxes to graduate with the right courses.
Right.
Embedded learning, connecting to community and needs, finding those great partners. And sometimes it's community colleges, sometimes it's other school districts. We have a lot of career academies where neighboring districts are sending students for certain slots for certain things into one general facility. We are just now kind of embedding that career conversation a little bit earlier in the process. We had some legislative changes to get kids connected to content in 5th and 6th grade and 7th and 8th grade. I think that'll help. That'll help drive some of it. And then we also have a work-based learning initiative that's really strong in Iowa that's not necessarily career and technical education that counts as a CTE credit, but it's for kids that need to have those experiences again to see what lies ahead. And if you don't have any of those, then even if you go to college, you might be on your 3rd declared major before you figure out what you're passionate about.
That's true.
So part of it is, how do you find out what this kiddo is really excited about? And here are all the opportunities that we've prepared them for.
Yeah. When you look at the different opportunities that a school might stand up, and if they do have to cut something because their budget calls for that, what do you do what's your keep or sunset test when you've got programs that are competing for those dollars?
Yeah, that's one of the hardest questions we have. So I think one of the thing is you can't have any more sacred cows. You can't have something that only has a class size of 3 because you love the teacher and the community thinks the program's great. So you have to look at an economy of scale. What am I delivering? What good for whom at what cost? And when you look at that, you start to say, first of all, your non-negotiables are here are the things we have to do to stay accredited, which has really grown in Iowa. We keep adding to that. We don't take anything away. So we now have to have computer coding offered at every school. We have to provide that content in middle school. There are things that we have to do. So those are your non-negotiables. If we want to stay in business as a district, we do that. And there is a point at which you probably have to say, as that non-paid volunteer school board member, I know that's a non-negotiable, but what am I not providing for my students that if we actually reorganized with the neighbors, they would have? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the hardest conversations to have because, a string orchestra program is really important for that one student who's going to be the violinist. And you can't have that necessarily in a district of 250 kids. So how do you decide what you need to have? And if we don't get that decision made at the right time, that's where all of the impacts of competition, whether that be charter schools, private schools, or just open enrollment into a neighboring public school district, that's where you start to feel that, I think, the most.
Absolutely. I want to shift to, you mentioned teacher recruitment and retention as being an issue. And there is a program, an apprenticeship program that got started. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then what is it structured like?
Sure, you bet. So it's called the Teacher Ampera Registered Apprenticeship Grant Program. So we call it TPRA, so we don't have to say that every time. And it started in 2022 when Governor Reynolds had some pandemic COVID money that was given to governors to address problems created by the pandemic. And coming out of the pandemic, we had a teacher shortage. We had one before that, and we saw it coming. We had a drop in people graduating from universities over the 10 years before that in Iowa by 11%. And our enrollment was growing at that time. And Iowa was doing really well compared to the rest of the nation. I think Minnesota had a 54% drop in graduates coming out during that 10-year period. Yeah. So it was coming. But when the pandemic hit, we had some teachers who were nearing retirement, who weren't going to go through learning how to teach a class online, or had health issues and didn't want to be exposed because we had school. We were only shut down for that spring of the pandemic. We came back to school that next fall. So there were a lot of reasons why we saw that teacher shortage exacerbated. And we had been talking as RSAI advocates for a couple of years before that about we need to grow your own program. And the TPRA program worked with the Department of Labor and Workforce Development and the Department of Education to create these apprenticeships. There were two tracks. One track was, how do you get high school kids interested in teaching? So high school students could work as paraeducators while they're getting their para certificate. They had hours they worked during the day. It might be one period, it might be two, it might be during the summer. But during that time, they also had a course they were taking from either the area education agency or from community college to get that certificate. And after that, they could start working on credit toward teaching. And there were minimum wages you had to pay, but they were starting to make some money, and it created some enthusiasm for going into teaching they wouldn't have had before.
Right.
The other track was, if you have a paraeducator, how they could become a teacher. And for paraeducators, they had to have either that associate's degree or check off some boxes first. Once they had that, they could start working through all of the competencies of teaching with a post-secondary institution. Mm-hmm. And we had some of those online, like Western Governors University. We had some of them that have been ingrained in Iowa geographically for years, like University of Northern Iowa or Iowa State or Buena Vista or, all of those. And there had to be, for the structure of a program, for district to opt in, they had to have at least 10 individuals that wanted to work toward a credential. And for many of our rural schools, we didn't have 10 paras that wanted to become teachers. So our rural schools group, RSAI, formed a consortium. So 30 of those smaller districts could work together. And sometimes they had 2 or 3 individuals working through it. But we had thank goodness, this Cherokee Community School District in Northwest Iowa took the fiduciary lead. And then we helped them with all of the requirements of, you had to have an MOU, a memorandum of understanding with a post-secondary institution, and a mentor teacher, and who was in charge of making sure they were completing the competencies, and how many courses were they taking at a time. The structure of reimbursement changed halfway through. It used to be you were reimbursed for all the expenditures the district paid towards them. You got that money back out of that COVID pandemic money. There was a lot of federal oversight, micromanaging down to the penny of you had to have the receipt for the book that was bought at the UNI bookstore, right? And that was really hard to keep track of all that. In the middle, they changed the grant model to what they call a beneficiary model, where there was an amount that every district got for any student in this program who got a credential. If they got a course credit, they got reimbursed. And that became easier to manage, but it was less predictable for the districts because you had to start watching. If you give them a computer, pay all the tuition, pay all the books, is there a point at which if they're working very slowly through the program, they cap out. They can't get more than $48,000 of support over their time in the programs. You had to monitor it differently. We now have hundreds of teachers credentialed in Iowa schools who went through this program, who are already connected to a rural community. They already knew what it was like to live and work in Cherokee. That's different than sometimes getting somebody who comes out of UNI for the first year, and then they're used to having a theater and the gym across the street and the 3 coffee shops they can choose from, and they don't stay very long, right? So the difficulty of working through labor, the Department of Labor and Workforce Development, there are a lot of boxes you have to check. The program sunsets the end of this year, so we just have the end of December, and then the federal money's gone. So what we're talking about now is if we were to structure this program as a state program, what would we keep that was working? And I think the competency-based learning is great. The mentor support is really important. They even allowed just a little bit less student teaching if they had so many hours in the classroom before, things like that make good sense. And then districts need a source of revenue to provide the paying for the tuition and the other things if they're going to do this. And our state budget, like a lot of state, came out of the pandemic with a lot of money in the taxpayer relief fund and ending balances that were significant. And they lowered income taxes in Iowa to a flat rate and got rid of any pension income for anybody that's retired. No income tax. And so we're a few years away from running out of money, but we can see it in doing our 5-year projection.
Right.
So everybody's very cautious on investing in new programs. So we're hopeful that we can get some conversation about continuing that kind of program. It's been a game changer, and especially in some of our more diverse communities where we had paras who are already bilingual who now are teachers for students who are learning English. It's just a really great fit for our diverse communities, and we hope we can continue to talk about that.
Do you anticipate that is going to be possible?
I always start hopeful that it is. And if we do our job in advocating, then it will be. But, just like the school board that's having that really tough decision on what are we going to do anymore if we want to keep doing something or take on something new, our legislature is going to have those same conversations. And what do they stop doing if they take this on?
Yeah.
I don't give them too many suggestions. I let them figure that out. We just tell them what they should do.
So you work both with urban and rural communities. And can you talk a little bit about where those constituencies align and where they diverge, and how you craft a message that can move lawmakers without splintering that coalition?
Yeah, it's a tough thing, but what we have found that our urban schools and our rural schools have in common are high needs students, teacher and staff shortages, right? They both have the opportunity for good community support. So finding out what those things are, they both also are willing advocates that will participate with the legislature if they have the right resources. But we've had a lot of overlap in our policy priorities in those organizations. Our formula has no recognition of poverty in it. A lot of state formulas do. We don't really have anything for student mental health. And that, of course, has been a pressure point even before the pandemic started. And we have a little bit of training money now for, what we call mental health first aid, seeing it, but we need more investment in that area. They both, because they have declining enrollment and we have an enrollment-based formula, are hypersensitive to inadequate funding. So we found some alignment in those, and we're working on alignment with all of the other stakeholders too, whether that's the Teachers Association, school administrators. We try and all be in the room together and figure out where we can have the most muscle together.
Yeah.
I think the other major priority that's important for both of them is quality preschool, because our kids in urban areas are starting so far behind. If they can have quality preschool, they don't speak English, that's a whole nother year of language development. If they come from low-income families, it's a whole nother year of learning everything that they need to learn they don't have access to at home.
Right.
But they need full day because their parents are working. And in rural areas, they need full day because the bus can't go midday. We don't have enough money for that. And if their parents are working, that's another function of our very low unemployment rate.
Yeah.
So we've both been championing for that, that full day preschool. So we'll see what happens. We got half day paid for, but not full day.
So speaking of that, that's work to yet be done. What are your members thinking about for this upcoming legislation session that starts in January?
Yeah, it's interesting. Both groups have kind of just had it with all of these mandates that have to be implemented ASAP. So they're both kind of leading with local control first, respect this cadence of delivering school, and let's not have anything effective July 1 that's passed in April. Let's just give it a year or two so that we can do it within our organizational structure and attend to it and do it right. And so we'll be talking about a lot of those. I just wrote what I call a position paper for the rural schools. It's 1 page of why are local leaders to be respected, why the law requires it, and then 3 pages of here are the 3 pages of unfunded mandates you've imposed in the last 3 years. So just to remind the legislature that we have limited resources, and time and energy are just as important as money.
Yes.
In some regards, right?
Yeah.
Preschool's at the top of the list. Adequate state funding is at the top of the list. I always say that the shortage of the right credentialed workers, especially in the areas of special art, fine arts, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and career technical education, those are where the shortages are. And then in some geographic areas, you can't get a PE teacher or a second grade teacher either. But wherever those shortages are, that's the other half of the low funding walnut. If we had adequate funding and were able to attract and retain, grow your own programs, even get retirees from Missouri who have 10 good years of teaching left in them, whatever it might be, we have to use all of those patchwork pieces to make it work.
Yeah. So, Margaret, I always end on the same question, and that is, what does the term rural advantage mean to you?
Oh my gosh. The rural advantage is that you can't escape the love and attention of a teacher. Okay, there's nowhere to hide. We all know who everybody is, and we're going to take care of you. And the second half of that rural advantage is in students who grow up in that environment, grow up to be caretakers of others. They opt in because they have to, and they have a great work ethic, and all of that makes rural areas a great place to live.
Well said. I love that answer.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you for really cutting through the noise and giving us some clear sightlines on what Iowa's doing, considering how to implement new laws without chilling instruction, or how funding decisions really do ripple through rural communities, and how urban and rural can really stand together without losing their distinct needs. So really appreciate your clarity and your steadiness, especially in a season where leaders are just really standing on shifting ground.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity, Melissa, for making these podcasts available, worldwide to people who are interested and excited in learning more. And I'm just privileged to be here today.
Well, it was my honor. So thanks for spending the time. Friends, if today's conversation helps sharpen your thinking, then take it into your next board brief or your cabinet conversation or a community update and use it to bring more light than heat. If this episode was helpful, please like the show, subscribe to The Rural Scoop wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a comment with your takeaway. Please share it with a colleague who cares not only about rural schools, but specifically about what's going on in Iowa. Those signals help other leaders find us, and I read every note. So I'm your host, Melissa Sadorf, and as we say in rural leadership, our strength is our shared story. When we lead together, we thrive together. I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much for tuning in to The Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.